All right, welcome everybody to November's Rise and Progress. I'm Cambray Bayless, and Rebecca here will be presenting with me today on Michigan's first Capitol. We're going to mainly talk about the actual building and the piece of property the Capitol building was on, but in order to talk about that, we need to take a little step back a little bit earlier and talk about the first capital city of Detroit. Detroit was named the capital of Michigan Territory in 1805, but even before territorial officials arrived in the city, a massive fire broke out. By the time the fire was extinguished, only two buildings remained standing. Residents of the city and our new territorial officials went to work rebuilding, but this time, rather than growing naturally, there was an intentional building plan outlined for the city of Detroit by Territorial Justice Woodward. Now, the territorial government at the time consisted of an appointed governor and judges. One of the main responsibilities of territorial officials were to negotiate treaties and exchange goods with native tribes. For this purpose, the government needed a storehouse and meeting location. So in 1807, the Territorial Council House was constructed. This building was 47 by 25 feet and made in 2 stories. The first floor contained a meeting room and offices, and the second floor was a storeroom. The building was located at the intersection of Jefferson and Randolph, and it would serve as the main government building and meeting house until the construction of our first Capitol was completed. When we got to the point where, as a territory, we were allowed to form a legislative council, the Territorial Council House was outfitted with furniture made by Obed Waite. That furniture is actually going to be transferred to the first Capitol building, and you'll hear Obed Waite's name a little bit in just a moment. The biggest problem with building a Capitol, though, was how to pay for it. Because of the fire, it was very obvious that the residents of Detroit were not going to be able to construct public buildings. They had to kind of worry about their own houses and farms. So the federal government actually steps in to help. They set aside a 10,000-acre tract of land that's going to be used to help the citizens of Detroit rebuild. But some of that land was given to individuals who filed claims, but the remainder was to be used to construct a courthouse and jail for Wayne County. So if you take a look here on the 10,000-acre tract, you can see the strips of land here. Those are the traditional ribbon farms where people had claim to land already. And so the 10,000-acre tract is going to be located beyond that kind of already established area. And this is going to be beyond the scope of what Justice Woodward's plan is, where Justice Woodward's plan is located. So it's not intended to be the location of the new Capitol, but instead the land was going to be sold to raise funds to construct the buildings. Before the land could be sold, though, it had to be surveyed. And the survey began in 1806, but is not completed when the War of 1812 breaks out. At the end of the war, Territorial Governor Lewis Cass discovered that during the British occupation, the original documents of the survey either went missing or had been destroyed. In one letter to a surveyor, Edwin Tiffin, he explained that the territorial officials had no clue where the 10,000-acre tract was even supposed to be located at that point in time. Lucky for Cass, the federal government had copies of the original survey. So takes a little while, but they forward them onto the territory. And then James McCloskey is hired to do the survey work, and he finally completes the survey of the 10,000-acre tract in 1816. By the following year, the governor and judges of the territorial start trying to sell the land in a series of auctions, which were held at that territorial council house. Only 6, though, of the 80 lots available sold in the first 2 auctions. Eventually, territorial officials decide that the only way they're going to be able to build is to use land as payment to the contractors rather than trying to sell the land to raise money themselves. The jail is the first of the 2 buildings constructed, and it's completed in 1819. Construction of the courthouse is going to take much longer and doesn't begin until 1823. The courthouse was designed by Obed Waite, who received $600 for planning and supervising the building. Waite initially said he could build the building for $11,250.99. However, the territorial officials let the contract to a firm with D.C. McKinstry, DeGuillermo Jones, and Thomas Palmer for a cost of $21,000, so almost twice the amount. The firm, as mentioned, was paid in land. They end up getting 6,500 acres of that 10,000-acre tract and 144 city lots. As you can actually see from this later map, most of that 10,000-acre tract actually goes under the name of Thomas Palmer. According to the city plan, the new Capitol building is going to be located on a triangular area of land formed by State, Griswold, and Rowland Streets. So if you see the two buildings kind of in the center here, the one to the right is the jail, the one to the left is the Capitol or the courthouse, as it was called at the time. At the time the construction began, though, this was still very much on the outskirts of the development of Detroit. One of our early legislators would later recall that the Capitol, once it's constructed, was surrounded by no enclosure, not even a Virginia fence, but it had an enclosure which I shall never forget, for around it grew the rankest growth of Canada thistles I have ever seen to this day, 6 feet high and well proportioned, and as thick as a field of hemp could ever grow. So this is not downtown at all. Now, the cornerstone for the courthouse is laid on September 22nd, 1823, with full Masonic ceremonies, and that's actually the first Masonic cornerstone laying held in Michigan. 3 lodges were present, but none of them were full lodges yet. They were all emergent lodges, so they actually had to get special permission to act on behalf of the Grand Lodge of New York, since they weren't quite entitled to do their own Masonic ceremonies yet. The lodges met at 11 o'clock at their meeting hall and paraded to the construction site. A speech was given by William A. Fletcher, Chief Justice for Wayne County and Grand Chaplain for the event. Following the cornerstone laying, D.C. McKinstry hosted a large meal. The event was attended by local and territorial officials and many interested citizens. One attendee of note I want to point out is Orange Risden. This is a portrait of him, or a photo of him much, much later. He is actually the youngest Mason in attendance at the cornerstone laying of the first Capitol, and he lives long enough that he actually attends the cornerstone laying of our current Capitol building as well. He's the only person I know of who actually attended both events, and he makes a newspaper for that. Another interesting link between the first Capitol cornerstone laying and this building's cornerstone laying is that the contents of that first Capitol cornerstone were later removed, and they're actually placed into the cornerstone of our current Capitol building when we lay the cornerstone of this building. Now, construction of the courthouse is very slow. Again, because the cost of building was paid in land, McKinstry, Jones, and Palmer had to actually sell that land to fund the construction and pay their workers. The 10,000-acre tract, as you saw from our earlier map, was located even further out than the Woodward plan is. And again, I said that was a quite remote area. It was considered very swampy, and it made it incredibly hard to sell. McKinstry, Jones, and Palmer at one point in time even try advertising directly to workers in the paper. One article stated, carpenters, joiners, masons, stonecutters, boatmen, cartmen, and day laborers will here have an opportunity of becoming freeholders in their labor. It takes another 5 years to fund the construction. That does not work so well. By the time the building is completed, though, the Territorial Council has been formed, and the courthouse starts to be occasionally referred to as the Territorial Capitol. So, what did this first Capitol look like? We have some drawings, and we even have some later photos of the first Capitol, as well as descriptions. So the building was a Greek Revival structure of 3 stories made of red brick. It was 60 by 90 feet and had a tower that was 140 feet tall. A colonnade of 6 Ionic columns supported a pediment. There's no floor plan of the interior, but we do have some descriptions that give us an idea of the layout of the building. It was a 3-story building. The lowest of these is often referred to as the basement, and it's likely that the ground floor was actually accessed from the rear of the building, as opposed to the first floor, which you would have gotten to by going up those stairs at the front of the Capitol. Later descriptions of the building lead me to believe that there was not a staircase between the basement level and the first floor. You had to actually go outside to get into that space. The use of this basement level changed much over time, but it was generally configured as office space. The first and the second floor each likely had 4 rooms. One of those was a larger meeting hall, and then 3 smaller rooms used as office or committee spaces. A central hallway and a staircase connected the first and second floors. Financial records show the interior had walls of whitewashed gypsum plaster. The building was heated by a wood furnace, and there was not interior plumbing. Instead, an outhouse was constructed nearby. Financial records also show that the roof required repairing several times in the first decade after construction, and that in the 1830s, Venetian blinds were installed on the second floor. So let's talk a little bit about some of the uses of those spaces. Legislative and financial records show the way that the use of the building changed over time. So the first floor changed the least in the time the building was a Capitol. The Legislative Council used the first floor meeting space for the first time on May 5th, 1828. Furniture and desks from the Legislative Council House were transferred to the Territorial Capitol, but also an additional $1,500 was spent to outfit the room. So we do know they added some additional furniture at that point in time. The meeting hall, it was subsequently used as the House chamber after Michigan declared herself a state, and the first state legislative session was held on November 5th, 1835. An adjacent office space was used by the clerk of the House. The second office space on the first floor was used by the governor. We know that the governor's office was furnished with a mahogany table with drawers, a bookcase, and a paper case. And then the last room on the first floor was a library room. It contained bookshelves, and the library was started with just 131 books. Over time, we know portraits were deposited into that library room. The second floor also had a large meeting space. I don't know for sure what this second floor meeting space was used for prior to statehood and the creation of the Senate, but I believe it was likely used as the courtroom because financial records from 1835, when we're establishing a Senate, because we've now become a bicameral legislator, is showing that ground floor space is being outfitted for use by the United States District Court for Michigan and the Supreme Court. The judges sat on both of those at that point in time. So they're actually serving on multiple courts. The rest of the rooms on the second floor were originally designated as committee meeting rooms. One of the rooms, when the Senate was established, was used as an office for the Secretary of the Senate. By the 1840s, space on the second floor began to be used more by the executive branch. Records from 1843 show the Secretary of State had the two east rooms and a connecting door had been installed between the rooms. At the same time, the front south room was being used by the Adjutant General. Later in the year, there was talk of the chancellor taking that room and the adjutant general moving out. Side note, the chancellor, at this point in time, that is the head of the Court of Chancellery. This is a court that no longer exists. It's actually the responsibilities of that court were folded into the circuit court system in 1847. So it's a very short-lived court, but the head of that court was being given space. So possibly the judicial branch was getting some space back up on that second floor. Now, the basement level has the most fluctuation, as I mentioned. Most of the information we have about this level comes from the 1830s. In 1835, E.P. Hastings was paid $1,500 to repair and secure the basement story of the Capitol for the District Court of the United States. In 1837, a study of occupants of the basement found the space was actually empty. And at that point in time, a legislative committee recommended leasing the space to Wayne County for an archives and offices. But it doesn't appear that that happened, because by the following year, the legislators passing a resolution that says that the Secretary of State, Treasurer, and Auditor General are to have their offices in the Capitol or pay rent themselves if they wanted to have their offices in another building. It was really common in this period of time for a lot of our executive departments to be in other buildings downtown and a little bit closer to Detroit. We know this is the case for the Adjutant General, the State Geologist, the State Topographer, and the Attorney General. They're located in buildings other than the Capitol. Now, I also want to mention some of the furnishings. I know I talked a little bit about how much we were spending to outfit things, but one particular piece I want to highlight is what is known as the Patrick Henry Rostrum. This is because in the early 1900s, there was speculation the rostrum had actually originally come from the Virginia House of Burgesses. There are even postcards from the Pioneer and Historical Society that label it as the Patrick Henry Rostrum. In actuality, though, we know the piece was made by a cabinet maker, William Durrell. C.C. Trowbridge, who was the fiscal agent for the Legislative Council, stated the mahogany rostrum was made for the Legislative Council, but then also used by the Supreme Court. At some point, this rostrum makes its way to the second floor of the Capitol building because George C. Bates, a lawyer who appeared in front of the Supreme Court, described the rostrum and said that it was in the Senate chamber of the first Capitol. What makes the piece particularly special is that it was transported to the second Capitol, then became part of the collection of the Pioneer and Historical Society, and is currently on exhibit at the Michigan Historical Museum. So you can go down, you can see this piece at the museum, not tonight because they're closed, but later on. I should also mention the Historical Museum does have a few other pieces, some chairs, things like that, that we're pretty sure came from the first Capitol. And if you go up on our exhibit ramp, we do have a chair in that first kind of main case that also we believe came from that first Capitol building. Now, we also know that the first Capitol contained artwork. We specifically know of kind of 4 portraits that were hanging in the Capitol building. One of the first men to be featured in the Capitol is George Washington. And it's possible there were actually 2 Washington portraits in the building. In 1837, a committee of the legislature resolved that the clerk of the House be and is hereby authorized to remove from its frame the picture now suspended in one of the committee rooms of the House, a picture purporting to be a likeness of General George Washington. At the same time, they request a new, better full-length portrait of Washington and a portrait of General Lafayette to be placed in an appropriate place in the Capitol. Later accounts recall that a portrait of Washington was in the first floor hallway, but we don't know if this was a replacement or the same portrait, and this is not a portrait that is currently in our collection. We do, however, have 3 other pieces that were in that first Capitol in our current Capitol's portrait collection. In 1832, the Legislative Council paid Thomas McClellan for a portrait of Lewis Cass, which the 1831 Legislative Council had commissioned. There is some speculation based on more modern imaging that the portrait was actually a portrait of George Washington that McClellan had painted over the face to look like Lewis Cass. So that's kind of one of our interesting stories there. The next portrait that came into the collection of the first Capitol was a portrait of Stevens T. Mason, painted by Alvin Smith in 1837. The Mason portrait was donated to the House of Representatives by a group of Detroit men, including John Norton, Thomas Sheldon, and Andrew McReynolds. So that's actually a House piece, and that's why that one stays in the House of Representatives. And then the final portrait we know of that hung in that first Capitol is the Lafayette portrait that Jerry and Shayla presented on in August. So if you were not at our August Rise in Progress, I'm going to encourage you to go on to our Michigan State Capitol Commission YouTube page and watch the hour-long presentation on that portrait, because we have a lot of other things still to talk about today, and they did a great job on that. In short, it was painted by Alexander Simpson and acquired for the state by Senator Lucius Lyons and arrived in the Capitol in 1840. Putting these portraits of noted statesmen on display was really an effort by our territorial and early state officials to elevate and legitimize the government of Michigan. Now, one of the other things I want to mention about the first Capitol is that Capitol buildings early on, they are used as meeting spaces. So these aren't just going to be used by the legislature. They're one of the largest buildings in the area. So our Capitol gets used for a lot of different purposes. And in order to kind of give you an example of the variety, I'm just going to go through a few events we know that took place in the Capitol building. So these aren't necessarily all cohesively connected, but they're all fun for different reasons. So the first thing I'm going to mention is that our Capitol building was occasionally used as a concert hall. On June 21st, 1832, the Democratic Free Press of Detroit announced that M. Carl Bliss was going to give a concert of Tyrolese music. Tyrol is the region highlighted you see, and it's in eastern Austria and northern Italy near the Alps. So it is very likely, very possible that Bliss was a yodeler. One article states the powers of his voice are said to have excited the astonishment of even a London audience, and we doubt not from the manner in which his performances are spoken of in the papers of our Atlantic cities that every lover of fine, delicate, and delightful sounds will regret to hear that M. Carl Bliss can only remain long enough to give us 2 exhibitions of his gifted powers. Now, just a month later, the Capitol building is actually pressed into service as a hospital. On July 5th, 1832, a soldier on board the steamer Henry Clay fell ill and died of cholera. The ship was ordered quarantined, but just 2 days later, 2 cases were found among the residents of Detroit. By July 17th, there were a total of 57 cases and 27 deaths in Detroit from the disease. The upper floor of the building was converted into a hospital, but the disease continued to rage. Common treatments for cholera in 1832 included bloodletting, which we do know that doctors in Detroit employed during this epidemic. That was combined with administering mercury and camphor. And it's likely these treatments are what they're actually doing in the Capitol building. In August, the outbreak began to subside. The Journal for the Legislative Council shows the building is back open. They're holding session in it by 1833. But this was a massive epidemic. 4% of the population of Detroit dies in that outbreak. Which kind of leads me to my next topic, which is funerals and mourning. So we're using the Capitol as places to get together for these kind of events. The first time that is the Capitol is used for a funeral is after the death of Territorial Governor George Bryan Porter. Porter died on July 6, 1834, after a brief illness. Actually, some secondary sources today will say he died in a second wave cholera epidemic in Detroit. But if you look at the news reporting on when the second outbreak started, and when his death was, the dates don't quite line up. But we do know it's some kind of illness. On Monday, July 7th at 3 o'clock, residents of Detroit gathered at the house of Governor Porter, and a funeral procession traveled to the Capitol. Services were then held in the Legislative Council chamber with Reverend Cleveland speaking. After the services, there was a procession to the burial location. Guns at the Capitol were fired at regular intervals throughout the day. Businesses in Detroit were ordered closed from 2 till 6, and then steamboats were requested to lower their flags to half-mast. Another instance of a funeral in the Capitol building happened in 1840. On February 7th, 1840, a sitting representative from St. Joseph, Isaac G. Bailey, died. His death was announced in the House of Representatives. A resolution was passed where members of the Senate and House of Representatives stated they would wear a scrap of mourning crepe on their left arms during the remainder of the session, and a special committee was formed to make arrangements for the funeral. The funeral was held the following day. The eulogy was given by Representative David E. Brown. He said, in part, "We are here assembled to discharge the last offices of friendship to one of our number, to commit to the grave a valuable member of our body on whose cheek, as but yesterday, sat the promise of a long life." Reverend Bishop McCroskey performed the funeral rites, and a parade of citizens in carriages followed the hearse from the Capitol to his burial location. Now, both of these funerals serve as a reminder that travel took much longer, and we didn't have the same methods of preserving bodies in our early territorial and early state period that we do today. In this era, if somebody died while they were away at session in Lansing, it is highly likely their friends and family were not in attendance at the funeral. And that leads to kind of a third period of mourning in the Capitol. In 1843, the building is used for a memorial service for our first governor, Stephen T. Mason, who had died in New York. And so the citizens of Detroit, they assemble in mourning. They want to honor him. So they all meet on the grounds of the Capitol building. They parade to the Episcopal Church, and then the memorial service is held at the church. So they're coming into the space and kind of gathering to honor that first governor. Now, on a slightly happier note, the building is also used as a lecture hall occasionally. On June 7th, 1839, John Orville Taylor, an educator from New York, gave a lecture advocating for common school education. In other words, free, publicly funded education. This was the beginning of a statewide lecture tour that took him to Ypsilanti, Ann Arbor, Jackson, Marshall, Kalamazoo, St. Joseph, Niles, Edwardsburg, White Pigeon, Coldwater, Jonesville, Tecumseh, Monroe, and then back to Detroit. At the time of his return to Detroit, articles in the Detroit Daily Free Press pointed out that not every area of the state had set up district schools that were funded by taxpayers, and actually Detroit was one of the deficit cities. After his survey of the state, Taylor made recommendations to the legislator about how to improve education problems. Included in these recommendations was appointing an assistant superintendent of public instruction who could travel and make similar speeches advocating for establishing common schools. But it's not until 1869 that schools are free for all students in Michigan, and not until 1889 that textbooks start being provided by the schools. Now, in August of 1842, a different kind of lecture is held at the Capitol. This one was on science, and was accompanied by the exhibition of a new device. For 1 week in August of 1842, Russell's Planetarium was exhibited in the House chamber. Now, the planetarium, which we today would more properly call an orrery, was a mechanical device that modeled the solar system. It was built by James Russell of Columbus, Ohio. One science textbook described the planetarium by stating, "It comprehends all the bodies known to the present time belonging to that system except the comets. It includes the new planets and all the satellites. The dimensions of this stupendous piece of mechanism may be conceived when it is stated that the extreme planet Herschel," which we now call Uranus, they were calling it Herschel at the time because that was the guy who found it. So it hadn't actually gotten its name yet, Herschel moves around the sun in a circumference which measures from 70 to 80 feet. The extreme height of the apparatus above the floor is about 12 feet. Some faint idea may be formed of this fine mechanism when it is known that the weight is about 2 tons. In discussing the mechanism, a newspaper article noted the planetarium could move with 81 different motions at the turn of the crank. These motions modeled the rotation of the planets and their moons. The planetarium was available for viewing from 9 until noon and 2 until 5, and admission was 25 cents. Each evening at 7 o'clock, a lecture on the Earth was offered, and after the lecture, the planetarium was put in motion with the sun in the center illuminated. Cost for admittance to the evening program was 50 cents. Another type of exhibit that took place was an art exhibit. In July of 1847, The Court of Death by Rembrandt Peale was exhibited in the House Chamber. The painting, which measured 13 by 24 feet, was based on a poem by an Anglican bishop and depicted the various ways man could die. Admission to the exhibition was 25 cents, and a descriptive lecture was given by a Dr. Colton. After traveling around the country, the portrait was purchased in 1885 by George Scripps of Detroit. He then later donated that to the Detroit Institute of Art. So this is another thing from the first Capitol you can see on display if you go to the DIA. Our first Capitol is also occasionally used for church services. Again, there's some of the largest buildings, and we're not holding session on Sundays. So usually this is used by churches that are just forming and they don't have the resources to build their own buildings. A prime example of this was the Congregational Church of Detroit. The church formed in 1844. They initially met at City Hall, but in 1845 switched to using the House Chamber. They completed their own building the following year and then stopped using the House Chamber. The Capitol was also used for military purposes. So it's used for meetings and drilling of militia units. And this is where I give my obligatory, the definition of militia has changed since the 1830s, 40s, 50s, even 1860s. At this point in time, militia is referring to state-sponsored units. So it'd be the modern day equivalent of the National Guard. In 1838, a notice goes out to the members of Artillery Company in Detroit that they're going to have regular meetings Tuesday for drill. The meetings were to take place at their room in the Capitol. We don't actually know which room was considered their room, but my guess it's going to be one of those ground floor spaces. On July 6, 1842, the Scott Guard was reviewed by Governor Barry in front of the Capitol, and at the time, the newspaper claimed it was the first time a Michigan governor had ever reviewed soldiers. This is a practice that would become very common by the Civil War. In 1843, the military convention for the state was held at the Capitol. During the event, militia companies assembled and drilled together. They practiced guard duty, sword and manual exercises, and duties of parade. This was also a time to make sure that the militia units were properly equipped. They had to bring their own tent materials, mess kits, rations, and ammunition. Finally, we know that as the legislators were moving out of our first Capitol building, the building was used as a barracks during the Mexican-American War. 2 companies are quartered in the building, one in the Senate chamber and one in the House chamber. Now, there's one other big event that I have not discussed that took place in this first Capitol building, and that is our first Constitutional Convention, the meeting where we drafted our first state constitution. The convention started on May 11th, 1835, and if you would like to learn more about that, I'm going to tell you to stay tuned because February's program next year is all about Michigan's constitutions and constitutional conventions, and we will cover it then. So, Michigan's first constitution, though, does state that the seat of government for this state shall be at Detroit or at such other place or places as may be prescribed by law until the year 1847, when it shall be permanently located by the legislator. As early as 1839, Senator Greene was advocating to select a location to relocate the capital. Representative Ormsby likewise raised the issue in the House of Representatives. At that time, the cities of Marshall, Ann Arbor, Saginaw, Monroe, Utica, and Jackson were all suggested, but the real debate centered around whether it was even possible to move the capital until 1847. Nearly every year from that point on, the topic comes up for discussion. At one point, Marshall gets enough votes in the Senate, but the House does not concur with that. Finally, in 1847, time was up and we had to make a decision. Votes were taken over and over and over and over, but the same stalemate as before kept causing problems. Eventually, Lansing Township is proposed. Now, there are various theories about how Lansing became the capital. Several later accounts will even say that Lansing was a joke that just ended up getting enough votes and accidentally becoming the capital. But the truth is really more likely rooted in compromise. William Upton, a young legislator during the 1847 session, later recalled that there were 3 men vying to be elected to the United States Senate in 1847. This was before state senators were directly elected, so the legislator was electing the state senators. After 44 ballots, no winner had been declared. Most of the men supporting Richardson from Pontiac agreed to back Alpheus Felch if those supporting Felch agreed to a more northern location for the capital. And at this point in time, a northern location actually means Lansing. In his account, Upton does acknowledge that he does not know how many of those legislators actually kept up their end of the bargain. He also mentions each legislator received a map of Lansing, the proposed location, and outlining the distance between Lansing and all of the major cities at the time. And they were all about equal distance from each other. The vote for Lansing Township passed in 1847. This meant that a new Capitol building had to be built, and all the books and furnishings that were making the trip had to be transported into the middle of a, quote, howling wilderness. But moving the Capitol also created another big question: what to do with the first Capitol and who actually owned it? While the building was used as a Capitol, the initial congressional funding was for a Wayne County courthouse. Did the building belong to the state, the county, the city? Ultimately, a compromise is reached to use the building as a school. Rebecca's going to talk a lot more about that. But before we talk about the school, I do want to clear up the ownership question. But for that, we need to fast forward to 1875. The city of Detroit has a plan to widen Griswold Street, but doing so is going to encroach upon that triangle of land that the building is located on. So the Board of Education for Detroit sues the city of Detroit, and the case makes it to the Michigan Supreme Court. In the Supreme Court opinion, Justice Cooley traced the history of the land, stating that Congress had set aside the land specifically for purposes including for public wells and pumps, for markets, for public schools, for houses of reception of engine or articles for the extinguishment of fires, and for the preservation of the property of inhabitants, for houses of meeting of religious, moral, literary, or political societies or other useful associations, and generally for such purpose of utility or ornament as the City Council of Detroit may at any time by law provide. This, the Supreme Court explains, means that the Common Council of Detroit has control over the area, but they are not allowed to use it for any other purpose other than those outlined. So schools work. And with that, Rebecca is going to talk a little bit more about the Capitol School.
Hello, everybody. Okay, so we're jumping back now to 1849 when it becomes a school. So the Capital Union School, as it was called, was part of the Union school system in Detroit. The Union school system was a concept that was being used throughout the country at this point and even in Canada. But as it was defined in Detroit, this meant that this was a school system that was free. Each ward, which is like a district in today's vernacular, would incorporate a section of the city regardless of grade level. And you had to pass exams to progress in grades. The Capital Union School was part of the 5th Ward. So the 5th Ward was actually the most populous district in Detroit for several years, so this was one of the bigger schools. It had winter, spring, and fall terms. I did find occasional mention of summer terms, but that didn't seem to be very common. And there were a lot of grade levels incorporated in the one building. Remember, that's part of the general concept of a union school. So there was the primary level that would often have multiple classes. It was often their biggest level. At one point, they had 4 primary grades, which seemed to be typical. There was a junior level, which was moved out of the building eventually to make room for the high school. There was an intermediate level, a middle level, an upper/senior level, and a high school level, although the high school level was not there at first, it was added later. So the building, it was appraised at a higher value relative to other school buildings. It was also, as mentioned, ultimately determined to be owned by the Board of Education. But even before that court case, the board saw it as something that they owned. They differentiated it from the buildings that they rented, which was the majority of the school buildings. It would be decorated with plants hanging from the hanging from the ceiling, especially around Christmas time, and mottos on the walls for end of semester exams. These mottos would generally be just basic aphorisms like hard work pays off and such like that. There were also library rooms, but we'll talk more about that later. And there were frequent renovations. Notice that this and this look very different. There were expansions. They changed the setup of rooms. They added a water pump at one point. Remember, they didn't have indoor plumbing at first. Students actually had to go to the nearby businesses or even private homes in order to get water throughout the day. Needless to say, the locals were not really thrilled about that. So eventually they did get their water pump. Also, the building was pretty musty, especially in the basement area where the youngest students had classes. A father who was checking out the school as a place for his student to attend wrote an essay that was published in the paper in which he said that the basement area was disgusting. Why do we keep small children in there? And that led to a larger movement that got those areas fixed up. And the front was redesigned by the Beaux Arts School of Design in 1875. So that's why this version looks so different. This is the redesign after the 1875, redesign. So the building burned down in 1893. We'll get to that later. A large number of subjects were offered, a lot more than just basic reading, writing, arithmetic. There were things that fell under those categories, though. For writing, you'll see writing was a class, but there was also alphabet, spelling, grammar, composition. Arithmetic was also a class, but there was also higher levels such as algebra and geometry. Geography and history were also offered. The sciences were offered, so natural philosophy, which we would nowadays refer to as the larger category of natural sciences, so like biology and ecology and such. Physiology, mental philosophy, which nowadays we would know just generally as philosophy, public speaking, music, which includes singing and piano, so we know that there was a piano in the collection. And for older levels, there were languages. So these were mainly languages for understanding classic literature. So there was classical Greek, that would be for all the languages would be for the older students. So classical Greek, there was Latin, there was French. It's worth noting with French that Detroit was French early in its history, so that's part of why French was offered. But also because a lot of poetry and literature was originally in French, and to make students more cultured, they needed to be able to read in its original language. German was not offered. I specifically note this on the slide because it came up quite a bit. So there were frequent petitions to get German taught at the high school. These petitions came from local immigrant communities. There was a very large German immigrant population in Detroit at that time. And they were refused constantly. So the board would, after refusing them, would publish condescending speeches about why they would not teach German. Basically, these speeches generally boiled down to, you're in America, speak English. Note, though, they did teach other languages. There were 800 total seats in the capital school. Enrollment would usually meet maximum capacity and sometimes exceeded it. However, average daily attendance would usually be below capacity. That's why they could afford to enroll higher than capacity. This was a co-ed building, including the high school, although sometimes classes were separated by sex. I have seen multiple papers and articles and secondary sources that claim that the school was male only. That is not true. I don't know where this myth comes from. It comes up very frequently, but it's just not true. And we know this for a number of reasons, some of which we'll get into a bit later. But for one thing, we do see students' names mentioned sometimes in articles, and there were male and female students. It was an all-white school despite frequent integration efforts. The way integration efforts would generally be rejected is board members would say if we got rid of the school that were for children of color only and had them integrate into other schools, then they would eventually be squeezed out of education. Whether or not this is true, whether or not this was of pure motives, that is the reason they kept giving. Also, students were subject to physical punishment, especially in front of the class. That was seen as the most effective way to send a warning to the rest of the students. There was this one story that I found particularly interesting where there was a student who kept skipping class, and the teacher went to his father, and his father said, "Don't worry, I'll beat him." And the teacher said, "Oh no, that's not good enough. You have to beat him in front of the class. You have to come to school while class is in session to beat him at the front of the room." So that's what they did. So admissions work differently for grades below high school and high school. So starting with grades below high school, admissions would be on a first come, first served basis. The first day of the semester, you could come with your student to enroll. Students would have to bring proof of residence and vaccination status. Students from outside the Fifth Ward, remember that's the district that the Capital Union School is a part of, they could attend, space permitting. Priority would be given to people within the Fifth Ward. But people from outside the Fifth Ward would be charged. So they were the only ones that it wasn't free for. For high school, requirements included you had to be at least 12 years of age and you had to pass stringent exams. So not everyone passed the exams. Almost every time, some people would fail the exams. The exams varied year to year, but one year that was pretty representative. The exam included arithmetic, geography, reading, spelling, English grammar, and United States history. And then there would be a list of those who passed printed in the newspaper, along with a list of everybody who applied. So that I think was intended to praise the students who passed, but I think there's probably a humiliation element, whether or not that was intentional. All right, end of semester exams. So come the end of the semester, there would be exams to determine whether or not students progress to the next grade level. These exams were open to the public, and sometimes the audience would be very large. And part of how we know this is reporters very often came to these exams, and they would talk about, oh, it was standing room only, or we couldn't even get into a classroom. So yeah, it'd be very crowded. It'd have friends and family attend, as well as just anyone in the community who was interested to watch. Exams included oral quizzing, reading capstone essays aloud. That would mostly test writing skills, but it would also test public speaking skills, and reading the works of others, and that would be almost entirely about public speaking skills. And then the next day, recaps would be published in local newspapers, including the Detroit Free Press. And yes, they did editorialize about whose essays they liked. So staff, there would be at least 1 or 2 maintenance workers. They could be of any sex. The principal, however, would almost always be male, although sometimes there were female principals. The principal made the highest amount of money at the school, and it was a higher amount if they were male. Teachers made money based on their seniority and sex. Male teachers always made more than female teachers. And job listings would specify what sex they wanted the applicants to be. Like it would say, we're looking for female teachers, male teachers need not apply, or vice versa. We have plenty of female teachers, we need male teachers. And this would usually just come down to what their budget was like. Could they afford to have a male teacher, or would they have to settle for a bunch of female teachers? That was the only thing that differentiated the teachers, though. They could teach any subject, and they could advance through the ranks. They could teach, female teachers could teach all male classes, male teachers could teach all female classes. It really did come down to how much do we pay this particular teacher. So female teachers were much more common than male teachers because they were cheaper. They could work their way up the ranks. They were fired immediately when married. That was not originally the policy. That policy was adopted later. And again, that's something that doesn't apply to the male teachers. Male teachers could be married. Widows were allowed. All right, so just to highlight a few teachers, Maria Rockwell, who became very dear to my heart. I felt like I bonded with her, even though she died long before I was born. She was well-liked. She was highly paid. She worked her way up through the ranks. She resigned April 24th, 1857, to work for a female seminary, and I felt kind of sad once I read that she had resigned. Then there was M. Lillibridge. I couldn't find her first name, but I could find she was female. She was well respected by the Board of Education. She too worked her way up the ranks. She was charged with brutally beating a student, but she was acquitted. Harlan Orcutt was not acquitted. He was also charged with brutally beating a student, and he was convicted on October 24th, 1856. So for how brutal it may sound when talking about like them having their fathers beat them in front of classes and stuff, trust me, there was still a line. All right, so William George Dollerson, I'm going to highlight a particular maintenance worker. He seemed to mostly go by George Dollerson, although I've seen secondary sources call him both. He was a custodian in the Capital Union School in the 1850s. He may have worked in a non-combatant role in the Union Army, although I couldn't verify that that was him. And he worked with a tavern owner named Seymour Finney to hide escaped enslaved people starting in 1851. So Detroit was one of the last stops on the Underground Railroad before crossing into Canada. So that does mean that people from all over the country would come through Detroit to get to Canada. And so Seymour Finney gave the keys to his barn, which was located next to his tavern, very close to the Capitol, for Dollerson to be able to bring people into the barn and hide them there and then help them go on. What was interesting was sometimes the slave catchers who were pursuing the slaves would eat in the tavern attached to the stable where the people they were looking for were hiding. Most secondary sources only mention Finney, despite Dollerson being at least an equal partner in hiding escapees. Dollerson was what was known as a conductor, so he ran people between stops, and Finney was a station master, which means he ran one particular stop. So, like I said, they're at least equal. Possibly you can argue Dollerson did more. That being said, most sources only refer to Finney. Now, there's a few reasons for this. For one thing, it was Finney's barn, so it does make sense his name was tied to it. But also, Finney was white and Dollerson was black. And unfortunately, we do see that kind of prejudice sometimes in historic discourse. All right, so the library, I mentioned that earlier. 2 library rooms existed on the second floor. They opened in 1860, mostly for school use originally. While the Capital Union School building was a capitol, the library had been on the first floor, but as the school is on the second floor, I couldn't find why. That's just how it ended up playing out. It became an official public library in 1863, but then it opened to the public in 1865. The collection included nonfiction, reference, classic literature, and some popular literature. I stress some. The board would very frequently say in the minutes of meetings that we're not here to cater to literary gluttons. Heaven forbid people enjoy reading. The book collection grew rapidly. Within a short period of time, complaints about there being little room to actually spend time in the library due to the growth of its collection became a regular occurrence in the Board of Education meetings. This was eventually remedied with an expansion to the building, so 4 rooms were added off the back of the building for the library. And in 1875, the library moved to its own building. Evening events continued to take place at the Capitol. So a few that happened frequently was the Soldiers' Aid Society benefits or meetings of the Soldiers' Aid Society. During the Civil War, the society gathered medical supplies, food for troops, and various other supplies to support the troops. And after the Civil War, they existed to support veterans. Military parades for new cadets and other militia events did take place at the Capitol at that point, although by then, they didn't have their own room. They would be making use of other rooms or the grounds. And student-run extracurricular activities also took place. So there are debate societies, such as the Athenian Society, literary societies, such as the High School Literary Society. There was, though, a lot of overlap. As you'll see here, this is referring to a literary society, but it lists what the topic of debate will be. Very frequently, literary societies had debates, debate societies reviewed literature. The main difference was the names, which suggest the intended focus. So the building was destroyed eventually. Around 12:10 a.m. on January 27th, 1893, David Holmes, a high school student, spotted a light in the basement, so remember that's the ground floor level, of the Capital Union School while walking past the front of the building. Very quickly, the majority of the building was destroyed except for the outer walls. So what you see in these pictures, that is all that was left. The rest was completely gutted by the fire. There was no one inside at the time. As you can probably guess, it was midnight. But all of the items inside, including records and notebooks, which means all of the academic work the teachers were working on, was completely gone. There was speculation in the Detroit Free Press that the fire was set by a firebug, which at the time was slang for arsonist, although nothing was ever proven. So what to do now? Many people at the time had wanted to see this building gone anyway and felt that the fire saved money that would have been used to demolish it. Then Mayor Hazen S. Pingree, who of course would later become governor, had toured the building the day before it burned down and had referred to it as a fire trap. He was not a fan of that building. Some people wanted the ruins kept as a historic site, although other people, including Mayor Pingree and many journalists, wanted the ruins cleared away as soon as possible. And if they were to be cleared away, there was a lot of debate as to what to do with the area. Mayor Pingree, the press, and others advocated for the space to be converted into green space, so a park, which is ultimately what they decided on. That picture you see there, that is not technically of Capitol Park. That was a concept proposed by a journalist for the Detroit Free Press, although it did end up turning out pretty similar to that. The area continued to develop, so a bus depot was created as the city transitioned from trolleys to public buses in the 1950s. At that point, the whole park was generally redone. The depot was demolished in 1879, so a little over 20 years later, and replaced with an open layout bus station. And generally, the whole area started to fall into disrepair around that time. In 2010, though, a revitalization project started, which lasted for several years. The area around the park had started to flourish, so now there were investors who were interested in fixing up the park. So efforts were made to preserve the historic significance of the park, such as by cleaning it up and adding historic markers. So I haven't mentioned this yet because this deserves its own slide. So Governor Stevens T. Mason, he did die in Detroit. He didn't die in Detroit, excuse me. He did die in New York, but he was eventually moved to Detroit, and it got very exciting from there. So he died January 5th, 1843, and he was buried in New York. Remember what Cambray said about you couldn't transport bodies in quite the same way as you do today. In 1893, 50 years later, was when the first Capitol burned down. So that was when the decision to make it into a park was come to, and when they thought, you know, Governor Mason had more to do with our history than New York's history, so we really deserve him. So we moved him here. June 4th, 1905, his remains arrived in Detroit for reburial. The reburial ceremony took place the following Sunday. May 25th, 1908, the monument was unveiled. So you can see it in that picture there, although that picture's from the 1920s. December 1955, Governor Mason's remains and the monument were moved somewhere else in the park in order to make space for the bus depot, the one that barely lasted 20 years. So they were moved at that point, but when the revitalization happened in 2010, they decided we need to move it back where it originally was. So July 1st, 2010, his remains were exhumed. October 26th, 2010, he laid in state in this building. So he never actually entered this building while alive, but he did get to lay in state afterwards. October 27th, 2010, Governor Mason was finally reburied in his original location, Detroit's Capitol Park. And that is where he is to this day, and hopefully will stay. So nowadays, it is still a park, although it's undergone several changes at this point. Governor Stephen C. Mason's grave, as I said, is still there. There's a picture of me at it. Historic markers exist throughout the area, including for Finney Barn and for the first Capitol. So that's right there. I like to think the people who wanted the ruins to be left as a marker for the building in a way got their wish by having that monument. And so the legacy lives on. Let us know if you have any questions.
Yes, any questions? Yes.
What kind of vaccinations were required? The sources I looked at just said vaccinations. So I would not.
Smallpox?
That is what I would guess. So that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah,
At
smallpox.
this point, it would have been basically smallpox would have been one of the few things you could vaccinate against. And that was kind of actually created using, because one of the first vaccinations they discover is smallpox. What they discover is that there are folks who manage cattle that get something called cowpox, and that actually creates an immunity to smallpox. So they start infecting with mild infection. This would have been a live vaccine at the time. People with the cowpox, which is a much milder form. So things like that is how we're going to keep massive outbreaks from happening in a school with 800 people.
Mhm.
Thank you, Edward Ken.
Any other questions?
So were the earlier school boards elected or appointed, or how did they become a school board?
They were elected. Mhm. Although some positions were appointed.
Other questions? Yes.
On one of your slides, you had a list of potential state capital sites,
Yes.
and there was a red something.
Uh,
And I was just
oh,
Do you want me to go back to that?
That's a great question. It is no long. I'm trying to remember. It's Red Bridge, I believe.
Yeah.
Yes. I have tried to figure out where exactly it is. It is one of those places that no longer exists. So it's very hard to exactly pinpoint where that was because there's not a lot of description. You can't really pull out a map and find it at this point. So I am not entirely sure. I will say, though, I have attempted to track that down a couple of times. I've seen a few vague references, but nothing that's given me enough to be able to say, yes, it was definitely there. Yeah.
All Michigan place names or Michigan city names.
Okay.
In there.
Okay.
There-
I'll have
there
to take a
are
look.
several-
What?
Several such books.
Yes. Yeah. And I feel like there might have been two different locations maybe when I was looking. I looked this up several years ago, and I feel like it was like, oh, it could be here or there kind of situation.
More likely, the old county atlas is dating from the 1860s to 1880s.
Yeah, that's a Yeah. possibility. Yes.
Was Mason's family consulted with all the moves, or was this kind of?
Yes. Yep. His
Yeah,
family was
his-
consulted. In fact,
Family members were present at the different burials.
yes, so when he was governor of Michigan, he was not yet married. He doesn't get married until after he moves to New York, and his sister acted as his official hostess. During his time,
Five.
five.
The monument was 1908.
Yes, yeah. So she was present at the reburial. Yes.
Original acreage of that triangular piece of land, and did that original acreage survive to what's there today, or has that been?
That is a great question on the original acreage. As far as I know, that does survive today. Because that was what that whole issue was with Detroit, was they actually wanted to widen Griswold Street. And in order to do that, they had to take over some of the land. And the Supreme Court said, you're not allowed to do that. The road is, having a road on this portion of land is not on the approved list of things you can do. So I don't exactly know what the acreage is, but I do know that that's what that court case was all over, widening the road and making and encroaching upon that triangular piece of land.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Do we know how the building sat within that parcel? Because it's triangular and a
Yeah.
rectangular building presumably.
I believe that the building actually faced the river.
That's
So-
my understanding.
My understanding is that it did face the river, and we have, can I get to that picture quickly? We have a picture of a parade down. So here, my understanding is it did face just towards the river there. Let me quickly see if I can find something. I'm going to exit the, this here. And let me see if I can find a picture and share it with you folks here in just a moment.
Kind of wondered as they added on to it, if it started to narrow towards the back, if they were.
Right. And this is actually one I think I saw in your Capitol photo stuff, so.
One of the photos of the supposedly renovated building shows the one side exactly parallel to the adjoining street.
So this is showing an event where there's a parade in the street going up to that. So if we go back to this then, so I guess it would have been, that's a great question. Like, I don't exactly, yeah. Yeah, I thought that I understood it. And then I looked at this again and said, maybe I don't understand this quite as much as I thought.
To analyze it.
Yeah. Yeah. So here are a few other later images of the Capitol and where it's located. And that would have again been from when it was a school.
Well, as long as we're facing minutia, was the original building constructed of stone or brick?
It was a brick building.
Okay, because it kind of looked more like frame.
It
When you said it was renovating, that was really extensive.
Yeah, it was a brick building. We do know we can actually see in the list of supplies where they were sourcing the various materials they would use to make the bricks. We've got a list of advertisements going out from the contractors to people asking for the components to make brick. Yeah. I thought I saw a hand. Yes.
They were like enrolled in school when it burned, and where did they go?
It would have been at, again, it would have been at max capacity because it almost always was enrolled at max capacity. Where they went, there were other districts nearby, so they probably filtered out there.
There was actually a plan too. They were already kind of planning, and people had been saying that the building needed to be torn down for a while.
Like Mayor Pingree.
Yeah, like Mayor Pingree. And so there was talk of building a second high school building already in the works, but they hadn't done it yet. And this kind of speeded up the decision to actually build the building. So I don't know, there would have been a temporary, we need to find places, but very quickly they were able to then get and build like the second big high school building. And oh, I don't remember which school that actually is, but I could look it back up again and let you know later. Yeah.
They never really found out, and that's part of why the press speculated about it being arson, but they never conclusively found out. I mean, it was the middle of the night, but it was kind of a tinderbox of a building.
Any other questions? Yes.
So that new building, was that basically like it encompassed the old building and then
Yeah,
like,
especially the front side.
built? So like the tower
Yeah.
and all that stuff was taken down?
Yeah, so yeah, it was completely redone. I actually have seen articles talking about it like from when it burnt down, basically saying in essence, the original walls of the Capitol are in there somewhere, and this is why we need to save this. These are the people that are advocating for it being a historic site. They're like, yeah, it doesn't look like it was, but they're in there somewhere. They had additions on the back for the library. They had additions on the front to like make it a lot more elaborate.
Which was kind of a gradual thing.
It was, yeah, kind of they here, there, and everywhere. And it was literally like the original walls are in there somewhere.
Anyone glancing at this, been in the old Central, which became LCC, we saw the same circumstance.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you all so much for coming. As a reminder, we will not be having a Rise in Progress in December. We usually take December off because everybody's so busy that attendance is pretty low anyways. So we'll take December off. We'll see you back in January. January's program will actually be us opening a new exhibit upstairs in our rotating exhibit space. So we hope to see you then.